Hello and welcome to the MIT Open Documentary Lab Talks. I'm Sarah Wallison and I'm the director of the lab. And it's my great pleasure to introduce John Craig Freeman, who's an artist with over 3 decades of experience using emerging technologies, specifically to produce large-scale public work at sites where the forces of globalization are impacting the lives of individuals in local communities. With his work, he expands the notion of public by exploring how digital technology and mobile networks are transforming our sense of place. He's a founding member of the international artist collective Manifest AR, pioneering augmented reality art since 2010. Here at the lab, we've been doing a lot of work in augmented reality in public space and really exploring that field. And John comes up again and again as a pioneer and someone who's really been exploring this deeply and creatively for many years. So it's our great pleasure to have him here. Before I pass it over to him, I wanted to remind people to put their questions in the Q&A, and we will have time for questions after his presentation. Thank you. And without further ado, John.
Good morning, and thank you, Sarah, and thank you, William Eurico and Claudia Romano, for helping to make this happen this morning. Thank you, Open Doc Lab, and thank you all here and online. Whereas the public square was once the quintessential place to air grievances, display solidarity, express differences, celebrate similarities, remember, mourn, and reinforce shared values of right and wrong, it is no longer the only anchor for interactions in the public realm. The public square is where individual identity is transformed into national identity and collective action. As an artist, I'm exploring how the traditional forms of public art, such as monuments and memorials, might change in a mobile network culture with the intention of examining the social, political, and ethical issues raised by using augmented reality as a documentary-driven public art form. For over 30 years, I've been using emerging technologies to invent new forms of public art. Operation Green Run 2 consisted of 11 10 by 40 foot billboard faces made up of 2,000 individual bitmap images per billboard, printed from an early Macintosh computer on a simple office laser printer. It was installed in November of 1989 along a 2 or 3 mile stretch of Highway 93 just south of Boulder, Colorado, running past the front gates of the Rocky Flats nuclear weapons plant. But I want to focus today primarily on documentary-driven work. Imaging Place was a place-based proto-virtual reality project that combined panoramic still photography and video with game interface strategies to document situations where the forces of globalization are impacting the lives of individuals and local communities. The project was developed as a standalone application and exhibited extensively between 1997 and 2007. It included dozens of stories with hundreds of individual locations from 7 countries across 4 continents in the end. It still exists on a legacy computer running a legacy operating system, but is otherwise inaccessible. So one of the points I want to emphasize today is the ability for artists to migrate content across technologies as they evolve. The idea was to invent a new art form where movement through space becomes an act of reasoning. Narrative is constructed across space rather than over time. The project used documentary-driven content with the intention of allowing underrepresented people to tell their own stories in their own voices. And I'm going to play a couple short clips from 2006.
My name's Don Seymour. I'm from the Kellam Singing Band, and my Indian name is Kamchais. It means grizzly bear. And I went to the residential school from 1969 to 1974. And there were two different kind of students that came here. There's a day scholar and people at residential school, that residents. And I was really fortunate that I got to go.
And just skipping ahead a little bit.
Here, and I was in bed for most of the time I was here. Then I'd ask the nuns to give me some schoolwork, and they never gave me anything. They locked me upstairs. That was really bad. I was just so skinny, eh? And they'd give us clothes, and we'd have to wear it for 2 weeks at a time, underclothes and top clothes, and they'd give us cuddler oil, and the big girls spill it down our clothes, and we had woolen sweaters and that cuddler oil. We'd have to stand that smell for 2 weeks, eh? That was really torture place to be here, and I sure hate coming in here right now even.
So, of course, Canada's Indian residential schools surfaced in international media last June when the remains of 215 children were found buried near Kamloops Indian Residential School. Imaging Place was an attempt to create a new art practice which was native to electracy, and to give form to the ideas that my colleague and collaborator Greg Ulmer and I were exploring along the Miami River in 1997. Ulmer describes electracy as a kind of post-literate skill or facility necessary to exploit the full potential of emerging technology and global networks. In 2007, 2 years after executives from Google attended an exhibition of Imaging Place in Lowell, Massachusetts, the first versions of Google Street View were released. In the mid-1950s, Paris, Guy Debord and the Situationists International developed a new concept for movement through urban space and named it psychogeography. Psychogeography proposed a total dissolution of the boundaries between art and life. The practice often structured movement through urban space using two constituent concepts: the derive, a kind of open passage walk or drift, and the plaque tournant, a vortex or center of power where forces come together to create strong atmosphere. Participants were encouraged to ignore the normal traffic flows and circulations of planned urban environments and instead move through a city in a way that follows its moods. The goal was to track the city's emotions, the feeling and atmosphere of a place. Here in 2005 from the streets of Sao Paulo, Brazil. My work builds on the work of Debord and his contemporaries and adapts their ideas to a mobile network society and the emergence of a virtual space which corresponds to and supplements our physical experience. And here in the night markets of Taipei in 2006. Although the work
Anche io, ma è impressionante, ragazzi. Avete capito che cosa sta facendo questo? Guardate il video.
E come fa a prendere noi?
Quello specchio riflette voi.
Ah, riflette noi.
Quindi vedi Alessandro, vedi,
guarda che luna!
sta praticamente punta a 360 gradi, è una fotografia a 360 gradi.
Che bello!
E
E sto giochino quanto
quello
costa?
specchio là riflette tutto il cielo.
Ma bellissimo. Ci siamo noi, sì.
Although the work has evolved since 2007, the theoretical foundation still exists in my approach to augmented reality.
Paghi, ti fa la foto.
With augmented reality, the physical world replaces the screen, but the narrative requires the audience to explore the virtual space and contend with the juxtaposition of the surrounding real world. The electorate culture knowledge will be networked, immersive, social, and will provide adventure and fun, not unlike playing a video game. Just like technology, new forms must be invented. Now immersive 360 cinema, or so-called VR cinema, is commonplace. But in 2008, neither the hardware nor the software existed for panoramic video.
And I'm now working in West Belfast. And where we were born, there was no peace wall or anything. It was in a small district with 4 streets, but it was all Catholic area. And it was surrounded by Protestants, or loyalists as they're called now. And there was no peace wall, but there was a type of an invisible peace wall where you knew not to go into their streets because you had been called a pig or a pokehead or stones.
So here I retrofitted a cadiotropic mirror to a conventional video camera. And the Imaging Belfast from 2009 documented the legacy of the Troubles and the violent conflict between the Protestant Unionists and the Catholic Nationalists in West Belfast, and the peace line that separated the two communities. The work spanned all of West Belfast and was produced 30 years since the Troubles began, and in the case of this scene from the Conway Mills, 30 years to the day.
It's not that long ago.
So virtual reality is a computer-generated 3D environment that is presented to the user in such a way that she suspends her disbelief and accepts it as real. It is typically assumed that the user is isolated from the surrounding world by some sort of headset or viewing system. Geolocated augmented reality, on the other hand, engages the user with the surrounding by allowing people to experience alternative realities at site-specific location through the camera of mobile devices. It uses location detection technology to superimpose virtual objects, people, or scenes at precise longitude and latitude coordinates anywhere on Earth, enabling users to immerse themselves in virtual realities as if it existed in that physical location. Curated by George Fifield of the Boston Cyber Arts, Virtual St. Petersburg and Virtual Wuhan were included in the 2017 public art exhibition, The Augmented Landscape, at the Maritime National Historic Site in Salem, Massachusetts. Border Memorial Fronteras de los Muertos is an augmented reality public art project in Memorial dedicated to the thousands of migrant workers who have died along the US-Mexico border in recent years trying to cross the desert Southwest in search of work and a better life. Deployed in 2012, the project allows people to visualize the scope of loss of life by marking each location where human remains have been recovered along the border and the surrounding desert. Based on a traditional form of Oaxacan wood carving from Oaxaca, the virtual augmentation object consisted of a life-size, 3-dimensional geometric model of a skeleton effigy, or calaca. The calacas are used in commemoration of lost loved ones during the Mexican Dias de los Muertos, Day of the Dead festivals. This image is from, the project makes use of data collected by the Pima County Medical Examiner's Office since 1996. Every time human remains are recovered, the GPS location is recorded along with any other details and collected into a vast database made up of thousands of individual data points. When I first acquired the data, I dropped it into Google Earth to visualize the scope of the project. That was that movie that was just playing. So in the early 1990s, we witnessed the migration of the public sphere, from the physical realm, the town square and its print augmentation, to the virtual realm, the placelessness, the everywhere but nowhere of the internet. In effect, the global network has facilitated the emergence of a new virtual space, which corresponds to the physical geography around us. People are on the move. With this work, meaning is structured by movement through space. It responds to the emergence of this new virtual space and calls attention to our transition from our physical experience to an increasingly virtual experience. We all interact with this virtual space every time we try to get a better cell signal or send a text, every time we connect to a Wi-Fi network or navigate using GPS. My work is intended to give this new virtual space form and meaning. So my cabbage patch just outside of Yuma, Arizona. So imagine now the entire mobile internet and the physical manifestations of place as a worldwide public square. From my earliest work in geolocated augmented reality, I've been working with the metaphor of portals. In 2011, I was invited to participate in the Distributed Collectives exhibition at Little Berlin Gallery in Philadelphia. There I created the first version of Metronext, which was originally strictly virtual. Modeled from direct observation of a vintage New York City subway station, the idea was to create a portal to a new reality, which would transport people symbolically from Philadelphia to cities around the world, in this case, Lausanne, Switzerland, where another Metronext station could be found. In 2014, after some folks from ETH in Zurich read about the Metronext project, I was offered the opportunity to fabricate a physical Metronext station and place it back into Grand Central Station in New York City. The project not only symbolically transported viewers to Zurich, it was intended to ease people's transition from the physical experience to a virtual experience. Virtual Zurich included the historic town center near the fabled Café Voltaire. And so Metronext was my first foray into photogrammetry, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So photogrammetry is a technology used to create 3D models from the real world. So it's my attempt to bring the reality to virtual reality. A series of photographs taken at multiple angles can be analyzed, and the parallax differences of key features in the image can be measured and plotted in space. In addition to its position in space, each point is assigned a color value, and the result is referred to as a point cloud. The point cloud data can be converted into a polygonal mesh or used in its original state for virtual or augmented reality. And a point cloud file is a vertex list. It's, in this case, a list of 14.9 million lines of code. Each line represents the XYZ coordinates and its RGB color value. Here's an example of virtual reality using raw point cloud data.
从哪一年搬过来的？
妈很早啦，因为我妈妈生我的时候就搬在这里来了。现在那边楼上住， 我爷爷以前解放前就在那个对面那里卖副食，卖烟呢，卖什么？
啊，那就当时那是哪一年的？大概是？
那我就不清楚了，那
不清楚了
要对，那不那解放前吧？
哦，那解放后你们就搬进来了吗？
对，解放后。
那你们是怎么搬进来的呢？是房子是？
房子就是以前我们是两处的房子不在一起，后来居委会的主任看见我们家人多了，就把我们两处的房子挑成一处了，就在也是在这个院子里面。
就在里头啊，这房子上是国家给的是吗？
国家给的，
也没给
我
要钱。
们只出那个房租。
他出房租？
一个月只是10几块钱。
一个月就10几块钱？哦，那就相当于很便宜。
现在都是了。
哦。
但是产权呢，什么都不是我们的，只是有住房证。
那你这里住了这么久的话，你的感觉怎么样？
Eventually, that was from the virtual Wuhan virtual reality project that included hundreds of locations in the city of Wuhan, China in 2016. I'll talk about that more in a moment, but if you continue exploring the space, it's bilingual so that the stories are translated into English, and it tells about the Russian tea merchant who built this palace in 1909, and it has become housing for common people these days. So you kind of hear those stories as you're exploring the space. For augmented reality, the point cloud is converted into a polygon model. The point cloud data is just kind of too much for a phone to be delivered over a phone. In this case, we start with 1 million polygons. And then if it's reduced to 100,000 polygons, say, then the software can generate the file texture, and we get a low polygon world scale augmented reality scene that can be delivered on a phone for augmented reality. I'll show some examples of that here in a moment. One of the things I've been most interested during the pandemic in exploring is how to leverage the emergence of certain standards so that content can become platform agnostic. So it's easy to move between virtual reality and augmented reality. And I think that this is an important point for anybody, any artist that is working in kind of digital media, that if you don't find a way to migrate the content just becomes lost to time. Also, just as a kind of basics, there's essentially 3 different broad categories of augmented reality, just to kind of emphasize this. The most common is image tracking augmented reality, where the augmented experience is anchored to an image or a code. And here at the Everywhere But Nowhere exhibition in the LA Arts District in 2017. And of course, the geolocated augmented reality is the type of reality, augmented reality that we made use of extensively in the International Artists Collective Manifest AR starting in 2010. We were interested in the idea of bringing these virtual experiences to very specific places around the world based on their longitude and latitude, and the meaning is constructed with the virtual experiences juxtaposition with its local surrounding. Not unlike Sergei Eisenstein's invention of the language for montage for the emerging media of cinema in the early 20th century. The languages need to be invented. So. Most recently, the innovations have created a new type of augmented reality that can be geofenced, meaning that there could be an area where it can become available to a user on their phone. But the anchoring of the virtual experience is based on the phone's spatial awareness and its ability to detect a plane or ground or a tabletop. And in this case, this was from the fossil fuel from the augmented reality art on the Greenway exhibition in the summer of 2019. In 2016, I was commissioned by the United States Department of State and 01 to participate in a 6-week residency in the city of Wuhan in central China, where I built the portal to an alternative reality as part of the American Arts Incubator. It included a 4-meter tall temple gate and used virtual and augmented reality to examine how change is being experienced by the local people in one of the fastest changing cities in the world, I'll point out. So portions of this work are currently on exhibition in the social VR platform Sansar. And again, considering these the idea of social VR constituting a kind of public space now. This idea that not only augmented reality experiences can constitute a new kind of public art, so can virtual reality, as long as the platform itself has a social component where other avatars can gather and experience the work. And so with this work, the virtual scenes can actually be extracted when you come across these kind of signs that have a QR code where you could then read the QR code with your phone and extract the virtual experience out of virtual reality and onto your phone. And so here's an example of that. Those of you online or anybody here in the room, if you take your phone out right now, I'll give you a moment to read this code. It'll download an application called Hoverlay, which is like a augmented reality browser app that allows the artists to kind of focus on generating content. In the early days of Manifest AR, we had a kind of similar application. They kind of went belly up. But Hoverlay is a local startup here in Boston who have been developing this application with a user interface that allows artists to kind of, instead of the artists all having to become app developers, you can just focus on the artwork itself. The app is kept cross-platform and up to date, and it allows the artist to really just explore the content. So it's a good solution at this point. Once you've downloaded the application, you might want to stand up and you should swipe through the entry screens. But then once it loads the project, you'll want to kind of stand up and allow the phone to find the ground in the room where you're at now, and it should go ahead and load up the virtual experience. And let me know, sir, if that works for you. Yep. Are you seeing the virtual? Yep. Yeah. I don't know if we can hear from the group at. Were you able to get that one? Okay, can I see here for a second? Let me get you in the camera too. Yeah, there you go. Yep, that's good. Okay, and of course, if you unmute the phone's audio, then you'll be able to hear the narrative stories. Yeah, and here's an example of a few more scenes that those of you, I really hope to engage the folks out there over in Zoom land to take advantage of this. But I also think if the tech team can we take a few questions at this point? I have a couple more projects I could talk about, but while people are doing this, we could have a little bit of a discussion. I'll just leave this on the screen for people.
All right, so we're going to take some questions. Sure. There's a question from Kimberly Bowser. She says, hi, the live-in-place destination concept is exciting. I'm curious if there are also capability for real-time live experience in a said destination.
Meaning like animated people at this point or something? Is that the audio right now I'm working with a form that is a little bit more associated with photography. It's just a 3D version of a photographic experience where that image can be inhabited and moved around and so forth in full 3 dimensions. The technologies are starting to converge to allow something like volumetric recording of a 3-dimensional subject. That is working in virtual reality, but it's a bit much for everyday phones. There is this kind of technique where you could shoot a person on video with green screen and then just superimpose them on a plane that allows for that always points towards the user, so you never know it's just a plane, and that can work. I'm more interested in, again, trying to develop a form that can be replicated for myself and others. Kind of the world of that work can expand, kind of like I did with Imaging Place, where I just keep adding to the database of content in a way that's streamlined and easy to deliver on the phone. But there are options that are out there. Animations can be included. I think Fossil Fueled had an animation. Is that working now, William? Yeah, great. Yeah.
Great. There's a. Yeah. William, you want to ask a question?
Oh, sure. Just have to read. I forgot what I asked. Yeah, so one of the terms you've used a few times is exploration. Users need to explore these spaces, and of course the still dominant mode of reception is spectator. People sit back and let their jaw hang loose. So I'm interested in how you see that working. Is it do you see over the 30 years you've been doing this? Do you see a growth in that capacity? Is it something our phones have really encouraged us to learn? Do you see ways to promote it or push it a little bit to teach it? And especially, are there ways to make engagement critical?
So yeah, a couple of responses to that. The first thing I would say is looking back historically, and this is some of the work that Greg Oliver and I kind of worked on in the 90s about this idea of the emergence of something beyond literacy that the world is just starting to, it's undergoing based on the emergence of technology. And that if we can kind of look back at the transition from oral culture to literate culture, we can make predictions about this transition we're currently undergoing. So in doing that, what we see is that all forms of human storytelling from its earliest inceptions, from the epic poem to the modern cinema, to novels and any kind of storytelling, always is the meaning is constructed over time. There's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end. But even early filmmakers kind of imagined this idea of the kind of expanded cinema space. Even Eisenstein and Vertov, the early avant-garde artists that were working with cinema as an emerging technology of their time, kind of understood that there was potential to kind of to move beyond using theater as an interface metaphor for engagement and for the construction of meaning. And so those ideas were largely not realized, but maybe it's in virtual and augmented reality that we can indeed realize this idea of a kind of storytelling that the meaning is constructed over space rather than through time. So in other words, you can't really anticipate it where people are entering the narrative. So it has to be fundamentally nonlinear. You can't really anticipate which order they go through things. And so the narrative itself has to be structured slightly differently, right? So as an artist, I'm trying to explore those ideas. Now, with the use of an application like Hoverlay, it becomes quite possible for people who aren't trained in media production to be able to engage interactively in work like this, right? So it is quite possible. We're negotiating doing a workshop up in Toronto that's going to take community members, and I did a little bit of this in Wuhan as well. I kind of went, I did some talks around in the museums and the art schools and the universities and stuff. Then we had a series of workshops where the community was invited back, and we went through a couple of weeks of kind of intensive workshops where we trained local people, not experts, but just local people in augmented reality production. Then it was still pretty challenging, but it's becoming easier. It is quite doable for anybody without any skill at all, just to simply make a recording. They can tell their story on their phone and then take that audio file from their phone and then drop it into a specific location. So the idea is that then you could construct audience engagement. I think it still needs to be kind of anchored, just like I'm kind of anchoring augmented reality experiences with a physical object. You know, the portal kind of helps people make the connection that they're going to go from physical to virtual experience. But it also, in order to get the audience truly engaged, that if you're bringing non-experts, you know, with the technology into the scenario, then it helps to kind of ground it in a larger project. So the idea here is that we're going to the art space InterAccess, it's called. It will, if we pull this off, the idea is that the building will become surrounded with the local residents' kind of story of the space, but it'll be anchored to a kind of larger project to help kind of facilitate that and give people the kind of stuff they need to know in order to do it successfully.
Yeah, I was curious about these portals and these physical portals, and if you could talk about them a little bit more about what they really bring to the project and how they're used and experienced and what they add to it.
So if I do so, I'll talk a little bit about Coming Home here. Because we had a portal for Coming Home, it was just like we built a kind of faux doorway entrance, and the project was designed to, I was commissioned by 01 in San Francisco to participate in, I'm sorry, this is a 01 project later. It's an immersive augmented reality installation distributed across the city of San Francisco. It's deployed in 2018 at a place called Proxy in the Hayes Valley. And the project examines the income divide in San Francisco and the dispossession and houselessness throughout the city. And so the idea is, especially in the early days of Manifest AR, when, you know, like an augmented reality public art project didn't exist unless people knew about it, right? And so all that we did in those early days was intimately linked to kind of social network activity. And so when in 2010, Mark Skwarek and Sandra Wienhoff invited the group before we became Manifest AR, those people, the early adopters of augmented reality, they organized an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art without telling the curators or the director. We just made our own exhibition, but then the word of that was circulated on social networks. So then hundreds of people started showing up at the museum with their cell phone, looking at artwork that the directors didn't know existed. And so we were trying to ask the question of who was going to claim dominion over this virtual space that was starting to emerge, right? Was it going to be curators and tastemakers? Was it going to be government officials? Or was it going to be the big tech companies and telecommunication companies? Probably the most accurate answer, as it turns out. But you know, in those days, it's very difficult to censor this kind of work. But you know, the idea is that you still don't, you know, if you don't know about it, it doesn't exist. You walk right by it, right? And so I had the idea pretty early on that people needed help into the virtual experience, right? And so to put something out in the public square still makes a lot of sense. You know, people are attracted to this curious object out in the space, and I also typically like doing kind of events that are kind of, so it grounds it in a physical location. Even though this project was distributed across the city, you could go, you know, across the city looking for these stories throughout the city, but, you know, it gave it a grounding in a particular place. Then people could, once they understood, they could go out into the city kind of looking for these kind of collective stories across the city, if that makes sense, right? Absolutely. Yeah, and so we do kind of events where we would have kind of docents that we would train with iPads. So you don't even have to have a phone. You just literally hand a person an iPad if they're worried about or they can't remember their password to download an application or something. You just simply hand it to them and show them around a little bit and get them thinking about moving through a virtual space, city scale virtual space in a physical location. And then you can say, okay, I'll help you download it to your phone, and you send them out into the city to tour it themselves. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So we have another question here from Ben Connors. He says, you mentioned standards that would allow artists, documentarians to future-proof their work and move it between platforms. What have you learned? Can you share more with us? It seems many 3D file types are premature and not standard. GLB, USDZ, and so many platforms are proprietary, Snapchat, Eighth Wall.
Yeah, and so first of all, I wouldn't go as far as saying that it will future-proof it. I think that that's close to impossible. But I think that the points that you're making about GLB and USD, for those less technically inclined, please bear with us here for a moment. That, but it is pointing in the direction of non-proprietary open source kind of file formats. Hopefully that still is yet to happen. USDZ is proprietary to Apple and so forth. But I'm thinking of it more in terms of like file sizes. We kind of know what a phone can download in in the current mobile networks, whether the G3, G4, G5, whatever it ends up being. In a few years, it's going to be different, but there's a certain amount of data, time it takes to download data. And if you kind of use that as your kind of budget, your content budget, and if you can make it look good, importantly, then that same asset can be deployed in virtual reality, even though it's not necessary. But one of the strategies that I've employed goes all the way back to the imaging place work, is this idea that you have a lot of stuff, a lot of material if you start collecting it in order to move through, right? So you think about kind of breaking it up. Even I threw in the images of the Rocky Flats billboards. That was like the kind of first years that laser printing and Apple Macintosh had still first started appearing on college campuses. And I had this idea of taking a giant, what it meant to take an image and make it 10 by 40 foot in public space. That wasn't possible. It wasn't possible to print out a billboard in 1989. And so this idea of breaking it up into little parts and then reconstructing the image in full scale seemed to me like a pretty powerful thing to have in the hands of individual artists, right? So you'll see that I continue to deploy that kind of parts to the whole thinking. And so like in augmented reality, there's a single scene that uses up the entirety of the data budget, but then you can go from that scene to the next scene as you're going, and then so that allows you to kind of expand the scenes by linking them together from place to place. And I do a similar thing in virtual reality. There's kind of virtual reality portals where you kind of, if you're moving through the city of Wuhan, there's hundreds of locations, and you're able to kind of go through these portals, and you go from one scene which represents a data budget to the next. And just one more kind of note just about future proofing. And just because I did take a minute to kind of unpack the idea of a point cloud, and the discussion of NFTs, non-fungible tokens, came up earlier with Cindy Bishop, was in my mind that vertex list, that millions of lines of code that are nothing more than the XYZ coordinate and the RGB value, seems to be as close to future proof as media like this can possibly be. In other words, there might be a manifestation of it in augmented reality that you could see through Hoverlay or in Sansar and virtual reality. And that's how it exists right now, because that's the technology. But even I would venture to say that in 100 years, whatever technology, if the technology is available, that it should be able to reconstruct that scene based on the technology at that time, if they just kind of understand that the first line of code is how many millions of lines on the vertex list. Somebody should be able to figure that out. So that's what the NFT would actually meant as for ownership and so forth, right? Does that yeah, I don't know if we asked them, does that answer your question in Zoom land?
It's hard for him to respond. Here's another one from Rob Ray. One of the things I love about this practice is the site of interest also being the site of the artist's synthesis, creation, and presentation of the artwork. The artwork or documentary becomes site-specific. How do your ideas and storytelling experience creation approach feel different when these processes happen on site?
Again, a little bit of, if you'll indulge me in a little bit of kind of theory, in his start background was in the early days of imaging place, we were interested in place, like in space becomes place when meaning is constructed within it, right? And so we had this idea of a kind of zone that was related to this kind of Greek concept of chora. And so I think that the word still exists in the Greek language, and it kind of means the next valley over, but it's not in a kind of larger sense, in the historic sense of it, the Platonic sense. It meant that the space, like the river valley in this case, kind of it includes things, it includes people, it includes agricultural practices, but it also includes like history and its own stories. And does that make sense? So chora is this idea of a holistic understanding of place. And the reason why that the Miami River was such an interesting subject for us in the early days, it was a very contested place. It was managed by over a dozen municipal and federal agencies. There was the Coast Guard, there was the local police, there was border control, there was the it was before ICE, but you know, you kind of get the idea. There's immigration, there's they're all kind of equipped, you know, they show up at the Miami River, they're equipped with these kind of loose leaf notebooks with all their rules and regulations, and they didn't necessarily correspond from one agency to the other. And so the idea was like, how do you solve the problem of the Miami River? And at the time, what was happening, that there was this kind of, the large mechanized shipping was moved off the coast to the port of Miami with the big, you know, the containing shipping as we kind of understand it today. But in the river, which was the original port, was the only kind of shipping that was being done where these little Haitian, mostly wooden boats, or smaller boats, but they'd load them full of, you know, kind of American refuges, like old used bicycles, mattresses, beans, and rice, and that sort of thing. And they wanted, the developers wanted the shippers, the Haitian shippers off the river. And so they would, the Coast Guard would slap them with fines for safety reasons, and they would eventually start, you know, gathering docking fees, and they'd eventually lose the boat and it would get, you know, dragged onto shore and destroyed or whatever. And so the idea is that instrumental reason, and we kind of seen this across the problem, if you take climate change or migration, the idea of where kind of literate instrumental reason collapses in on itself. In other words, that everything is so, you know, academic disciplines are so divided into you know, their own corners, and that nobody's talking to one another. And so when we take on these big issues in the world, we can't even conceive of how to solve them, because kind of instrumental reason just collapses in on itself, right? So the idea of chora is that if you can impart a kind of holistic understanding of a space that kind of emerges out of the experience of being there, and in this case, being there virtually or physically, if it's a virtual experience in a physical location, that it had this understanding, this kind of instrument, this holistic understanding kind of emerges out of that. And I think that this is what the Guy Debord and the Situationists International kind of understood this as well, right? And that's what they were trying to experiment with. There was a different way of conceiving of a place that it wouldn't solve the problem necessarily, but it might shift our perspective and give us a new way of looking at a problem, right? Is this your understanding of the question? Did it answer it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Sure. There's another question here from Raysam Donka Haum. What beginning steps or resources should traditional filmmakers look to if they're trying to jump into the virtual reality slash augmented reality space? Is the technology used, is it affordable rate for a beginner?
I think that with the proper augmented reality app, you know, I think that storytelling is pretty powerful, because I'm interested in people who aren't necessarily didn't go to graduate school and spend years, you know, studying this stuff. They're the people these days, as we know, that need to be telling the stories. It's not up to me to tell the story of Indigenous people in the residential schools. That you know, there's the First Nations people now that understand that it's their right to tell their own stories and that sort of thing. And I think that just simply speaking the story, if it can be placed in space, you can imagine the residential school being kind of haunted by the stories that are collected from the residents as they're getting, many of them are, you know, starting to age and stuff. Loretta Seymour, who appeared in that little clip I showed, has since passed away tragically. So it's a little bit of a kind of Holocaust narrative scenario where the stories that aren't told, end up not being told, then they're kind of lost to time. But obviously, it's ethically more, it's more ethical for the people themselves to be telling the story. And if it's simply a matter of training people how to make a recording, everybody has a phone, so everybody could conceivably tell their story. And then if it's just a matter of saying, okay, I want it here, then that's pretty powerful. Now, for my students, I start them out doing really basic 3D modeling and animation, because I don't, they don't stand a chance to really succeed at the high end of working in virtual reality unless they understand the basics of 3D modeling and animation and gaming to make it interactive. But I think that we're talking about something different if we're talking about community engagement. I think that we can kind of span that gap between seasoned and educated professionals and then community at large. And I'm hoping, that's why I'm interested in kind of community engaged kind of you use a term for these kinds of collaborative projects.
Co-creation.
Co-creation. Yeah, my colleague Rashin Farhandej is deeply invested in this idea of co-creation, where you end up collaborating directly with the community in order to get these stories told in these new forms.
Right. Okay, we have here a question from Emilia Gonzalez Marasa. Which are the apps available for AR art production, Snapchat, Artvive, Hoverlay, others that you could mention? Thank you. So she wants to know what apps to use.
Yeah, Hoverlay is a startup. I don't know. I think that they're kind of their API, their user development, it's web-based, but I think it's still in beta. So when that comes out, I think it's going to be an easy thing for people to use. I'm wary of Snapchat a little bit, just because I think it's one of, its reputation and failures in the social media realm. And of course, if people have the skills developing for iOS, using the App Store, they now have a pretty robust kind of development tool. I don't have my own computer here, but that users can get a hold of, and it's connected directly to their integrated development environment, the IDE that connects the visual work with the computer code, and ultimately prepares an application for publication in the App Store. And there's similar stuff that's happening in the Google Play, in the Android ecosystem. Both of those I find problematic, but some way we just can't get around it at this point. I find that the most difficult point isn't the technology. I think that that's pretty intuitive and straightforward for somebody who's got some experience with this stuff. I find it most problematic, though, with this the WHO asserts dominion over this question, because they don't, for instance, the App Store doesn't employ artists or art historians in their app review boards. And so I find that when I try and publish applications, that I end up having to argue art history so that they understand what it is I'm doing, so I can get it past the review, which I just find problematic. And anyway, Manifest AR got into AR because it was kind of a Wild West. It was more akin to street art. It was more like going out with a can of spray paint, and there were kind of no guardrails, and there was no tastemakers, and there was no voices of authority intervening. And I think that for those of you, who might have been in augmented reality for a while, might have kind of understood that there was a transition where Apple and Google all of a sudden understood the potential of this technology, and they went around, they bought up all the startups, and everything. Anybody who was invested in those kind of open source solutions ended up just, their work again was lost to time, because and the technology all disappeared for a couple of years, where Apple and Google developed it, and then they re-released it with to loop people into their ecosystem, which again is contrary to my ideas of art in public space. So it's always going to be a struggle, but it's important for artists to be nimble and be able to migrate you know, and be flexible and kind of think of the work accumulating over time and making the hard choices as to what makes it past a technology upgrade. Imaging Place, I had the presence of mind to buy a Mac Mini at the time, and you know, because that was the computer of the day, and I didn't change the operating system. I just put it away in a closet. And when I was asked to exhibit it a few years ago, I just plugged it into a projector and it worked fine. You know, so it's just kind of, the phones are constantly changing. Now the newer phones have a capability of doing something called object occlusion. So if a person, for instance, in the physical world, walks into the virtual scene, it will recognize that there's a person there, and it will occlude the background of the virtual scene, so the person appears to be standing in the augmented reality. So, you know, it kind of forces us again into this kind of never-ending need to kind of upgrade, which has always been a problem in digital art. But as artists, you know, my feeling is that we either choose to engage or we kind of leave the evolution of technology to these big, you know, ethically questionable corporations or pornographers or wherever, you know. So I think it's important that artists are there and engaged.
Yeah. I mean, I know you were involved in Manifest AR, and there was a whole manifesto, you know, with, were you involved in that? And is that sort of, was it, you had talked earlier about having to create these new languages. Was that sort of an attempt to create a best practices or language and get more people using it? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think that the idea of, and this is the opportunity for young artists in particular. I tell my students that if they can understand their role in this transition from literacy into electracy, then they kind of understand that there's agency there, that the forms and the language for these new technologies need to be invented, just like the technology itself. Somebody has to make a newer iPhone, right? And so, or a newer kind of like a VR camera or whatever. So there's engineers that are busy at work at that, but the forms need to be invented just like the hardware. And there's immense opportunity in that. You know, I think artists should always be making work of their time, and they should be trying to make original contributions, and with this kind of entrepreneurial sense of invention, that we're inventing form and meaning. And in that case, you can see where there's a lot where they have a role to play in real agency in this once they kind of get it. I think it's, you know, I think that there's a fight to be had as well, you know, keeping things on ethical grounds.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you write up your sort of best practices around, you said you're trying to invent these new forms that other people can use. Have you written up sort of best practices or whatever?
Maybe just, I don't know that I've had the opportunity to kind of write it up, other than just by example, you know, that this idea that it was kind of like you know, I mentioned that like these executives from Google came. And so this is before Google Earth and stuff, when I first was doing Imaging Place, this idea of being able to take a global perspective and kind of zoom down into to an experience on the ground. And you know, and so these executives came and they saw this exhibition of Imaging Place where it was kind of doing this. And so 2 years later, Google Street View emerges. And that's all well and good. It's kind of in a form. It is indeed a form that was adopted worldwide, you know, but they set out with the intention now of mapping the entire world with this kind of immersive experience. But where it falls short is on the storytelling end of things. Like, I wasn't interested in stopping where you arrive on Earth, but instead going deeper into the stories, that idea of Quora, where you go far enough into it and the people, the places and the things are there, but there's also, it's embedded with this kind of palimpsest of story and history and its local sense of understanding in the construction of meaning based on that particular place. Yeah.
Yeah. And what is your process? I mean, you go into these places that have these histories, these meaning people, communities are there, and you're creating work there, or putting a portal, physical portal. Who are you working with?
Well, I think that this is where the co-creation thing comes in. I think it's really important to kind of go into, don't just kind of show, you don't just parachute in. It's kind of like just parachute as a sculptor parachuting in and putting up a big bronze sculpture in the middle of Boston Common without asking anybody,
Right.
even if the art commission is for it, if artists these days just don't do that. There's these social practices where the community's consulted and stuff ahead of time. I take a similar approach wherever possible. I spent 6 weeks in Wuhan, and we had this whole kind of program where we kind of divided people up into groups so we could manage the workshops, and then we had each of the groups kind of present their projects, and we awarded micro grants to the best proposals. And then I went out with the groups to the there's a half dozen groups, and we went out to the half dozen places in the city, including the wet markets. There's at some point I had a movie that if you search it, you'll be able to find the Wuhan wet market augmented reality experiences. But that was in 2016 that I made that work. But yeah, so the idea is to go into the work along the border. I spend time working with advocacy groups, and I had an advisory board for the Fronteras de los Muertos project, where I met with organizations that help identify people and return the remains to the families and that sort of thing. And that's where the original database had a lot more data, and it became problematic to expose that data on its cell phone. But the actual place I thought was ethically reasonable to kind of mark. And that project spans the entire southern half of Arizona with thousands of data points. And to really experience it, you have to kind of get out there and hike into these places. And it's a pretty intense experience, so.
And what do you think about, people experiencing your work when they're not in the place? Does it work for you? Do you encourage that, or
it depends on
manage that?
It depends on the project. I think that, again, that there's the idea that Manifest AR's early work was this idea of kind of geolocation. So you say this longitude and latitude, I'm going to put an object there, and the only place you're going to be able to see it is going to be in Tiananmen Square or something, that you got to go there with your phone in order to see it. But I also think there's a lot, as I demonstrated today, that there's all these QR codes here from the US-Mexico border between the Imperial Beach and Playas de Tijuana, with the QR codes that are up on the screen right now. Documents this kind of place called the Friendship Park, where families will come and meet between the fence, and they've been doing that for years, and the Border Patrol's making it harder. But I went down there to kind of collect the stories of these families meeting with the fence between them. That's very
conceived out of place.
Yeah, the idea is that you can read the QR code and it's key to the experience, not the place. But then there's a version of the project that actually exists on the border, right? And so it opens up again the alternative forms that need experimentation, place-based as compared to available anywhere, right? And then you put it in virtual reality, and it's a different kind of animal, because the community are people that have headsets or whatever, the case may be.
All right, we have a couple more questions. It looks like you've started to use LiDAR. This is Ben Connors. I saw what looks like a BLK 360 on your Twitter page. Have you found it an easier tool than photogrammetry for faithfully reproducing spaces?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm glad that some people kind of I'm going to skip ahead here for a little bit. I think I have an example. So this is the Boat for One project. This idea is to kind of build a physical boat on a pylon that has a gauge for the sea level change as predicted by current science, right? And the idea was this is going to go out, if I can pull it off, out on Boston Common. But the idea is that it's based on science, obviously. The expected sea level by the end of this century. But then it would be surrounded by these augmented experiences that come from the real world. So we're looking at where places and communities are kind of vulnerable to sea level rise. And then the idea is to kind of animate the sea level coming up to the predicted level in those areas. So for the person who asked the question, this scene that was scanned at Fort Stark in the New Hampshire seacoast was done with the LiDAR scanner. So I think that the scanner has its place. So you kind of get a sense of how much of a scene it can create if it's world scale, right there in a way. You know, the Leica BLK 360, it's a kind of prosumer device. You know, it's not really consumer pricing, you know, but it's a little bit affordable. It's in the teens, teen thousands. I don't know. Haven't looked recently. So it's doable for institutions. To do this stuff really well, it requires some like sports car priced equipment that maybe you guys can get it here at MIT. I haven't been able to over across the river, but the you know, there's versions of Leica's scanners now that could do, you know, entire city blocks or something in a single scan. Now the problem I was finding is that there's this kind of difference in my work that you might notice, even if it's related to photography and the history of photography. It's that of street photography. So it's kind of the world as it is. And so it's going into a city and documenting the place as I find it, like a street photographer would, as compared to like fashion photography or studio photography where you had the controlled environment. And you know, you can bring a scanner like this, like I did a lot of work down in Nogales with this that I've yet to publish, but will be coming out soon, prior to the pandemic. But, you know, the world's a busy place. And if the scan takes, you know, like a good scan takes 10, 15 minutes just to make the scan where the device has to sit still, then, you know, people are moving around. That becomes part of the aesthetic kind of, but if you're trying to work directly with people, you have to ask the person to stand still for the time of the scan, or even with a conventional camera for the time it takes you to walk around and take 100 photographs of them. I find I can do it pretty quickly with the camera. With the scanner, you're just kind of, it's really hard for people to just stand in one place for 10 minutes and they start losing their patience with you. Whereas I've kind of made a rig with a monopod and 4 GoPros. So I have an array of cameras and I can walk around them in the time it takes for me to walk around them. And so it's a little bit like 19th century photography. You say, stand still for a moment while you take the lens off you know, the view camera or whatever it was, but it's still doable. You can interact with people. You kind of show them on the phone, here's what I'm doing. I make a 3D model of you, now stand still. And it actually becomes a point of engagement where people kind of open up to telling you their stories.
Yeah. Interesting. Asma Ajmer says, I would like to know, what is your advice on how to get involved in public art as a new media student?
So another good question. You know, my interest in public art had to do with my misgivings about the art market and kind of art fairs and the way that the market-driven art and its commodity value determine what gets made, what gets shown, and what gets collected by museums. And I had these misgivings all the way back in my undergraduate days at UCSD. And so, and it wasn't that I was trying to kind of replicate this, but I had this experience where the Southern California was undergoing this kind of breakneck development. And there were these Digueño and Los Sueños petroglyph and pictograph sites that were out in Rancho Bernardo in Southern California that were being bulldozed to make way for the new developments. And so I had photography skills. So I started kind of documenting these sites before they got bulldozed. And, you know, but there was something that struck me about them as I was kind of studying art history and having these misgivings about the art market. That brings us back to the question of dominion and who asserts dominion and the idea of kind of taste making and so forth. That there's this kind of this thing out in the real world that anybody comes across. And not only that, but it's uncommodifiable because even the early days of painting, it was painting on a cave wall or in the cathedral. It had its location. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution or the Renaissance, at least, where the painting comes down off the wall and a painting becomes a commodity to be bought and sold, right? So it's a fairly recent development that art is a kind of based on commodity culture. And so I was trying to develop new forms that kind of took a step back and said, is there a contemporary avant-garde forms that can be developed with emerging technology that can be kind of true to this idea of art being made in public space, and particularly with the kind of bad, in my early days, the kind of bad boy kind of street art kind of thing, where I'll do it no matter what people say. You know, getting the permission for the billboards was kind of an interesting thing because I was negotiating with the billboard owner who ended up being driven out of business by activists who didn't objected to the eyesore, the billboards along this very scenic part of the drive along the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains. So they were just sitting there empty. And I said, oh, let's do public art. And before anybody could kind of figure the kind of response, which was the international media attention of the nuclear weapons plant, as they were making the decision to close the plant, ultimately clean it up. Nothing like that had been done before. Like artists weren't using billboards as public art for the most part at that point. So it becomes this kind of window of opportunity where you can make work. And I think that some of the things happening with augmented reality, it's just a moment, it's just a minute, it's just a matter of time between our augmented experiences become polluted by crass advertising and commodity culture. That's what's going to happen eventually. I think that Snapchat, hope nobody from Snapchat's listening today, but I think that they kind of represent this kind of move to trying to figure out a way to kind of commodify our virtual experience, right? So to answer the question, there's this idea is that if you are trying to wait for tastemakers that can work, you better build an art reputation before you'll find that kind of civic art commissions and big museums to put physical work out in the real world is one of the most bureaucratic things you can possibly do. It's easier to get art into a museum than it is to put it out in public space for all the reasons that we kind of know. Whereas the augmented reality allows artists to have some autonomy there and get in and kind of intervene. If you read the Manifest AR manifesto, we talk about this idea of art as intervention. It's this idea of going into a discourse, not just a space, but a public, a social, political discourse, and intervening in a way that turns it on its head in a way. And those opportunities are kind of short-lived. But I'm all for empowering artists to carve their own path. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity, again, because these institutions need to be invented just like the forms, and they haven't yet. We're still thinking, the MIT, Emerson, they're literate institutions, right? So the electorate institutions, I think MIT and Emerson might be on the vanguard of literate institutions evolving into an electorate ecosystem, but they're still at their core literate institutions, just like all the big museums are and stuff. But some of them are starting to kind of understand this. But for young practitioners, this idea that the institutional rules are yet to be really codified, and so that there's opportunities to go actually in and intervene in the discourse that leads to that codification, I think.
What kind of institutions of the future do you see?
Well, the model, and this is what Greg Ulmer predicted back in the 90s, was that that people aren't learning their electorate skills at university. You learn your literate skills there, right? You learn to read and write and mathematics and all the rest, which is hard. Where people are learning electorate skills is in their entertainment experience. It's playing games, it's engaging in social media. You learn how chatting to your friend is different than writing the novel, right? It's a different kind of writing, and it takes a skill that ends up getting developed in these kind of everyday kind of entertainment experiences. So the idea, this is why I'm interested in Sansar and kind of social VR, is because it's already electorate. And we kind of play, but the idea of our collective knowledge and wisdom will eventually be more like that than it will the indexing of a library in literate culture, right? Eventually, all of the collective knowledge and wisdom will be ported, from the Dewey Decimal System into these kind of immersive experiences where people play and have social interaction and make friends and explore and all of that stuff. And that's why the forums, even though they kind of look like games, can be quite serious in terms of the content that they can support.
It's interesting because, you're subverting the art market and the tastemakers and the gatekeepers, and then you're creating your own technologies and hacking. So access must be something you think about a lot. Is there tension in that? Because of course, sometimes you're working with emerging technologies that people don't have access to, and then you're creating things to create them. I'm just curious how you sort of balance that tension between access and non-access.
Yeah, so this of course was going to be a question that comes up really early on in augmented reality. We were contending with it in 2010. It's like, who has access? Is this kind of an elite activity? And all you have to say at that point is like, how look at the numbers of how, take the best museum in the world, take the Museum of Modern Art, for instance, or the Pompadour in Paris or something, and get their numbers, like how many people actually visit the museum, and then, you know, like how many people actually have access to a smartphone now worldwide. And I think that you can get a sense of the potential for access to this technology as compared to, you know, more conventional kind of institutions. I don't think that there's any question. There's also the idea that you know, this, going back to this idea that the work doesn't exist unless people know about it. There's also this idea that the work can exist without being experienced, right? So the word of the breadth of the Border Memorial project went far beyond the people who actually went out. I'm aware of a few people, there are art historians and critics that actually spent like a week touring Southern Arizona and kind of getting off the beaten track, and because that's what it took to kind of really experience the holistic of it. But it also had this kind of way to reverberating in art history and stuff, people pointing at it as an example of a memorial for a network public sphere. And right, so it can have impact even, you know, like how many people have actually been to Lightning Field or the Spiral Jetty or Michael Heiser's Double Negative, or the Southwest has this tradition of these grand earthwork projects that span, you know, the whole of the landscape. And so I think that access, it's not that it's not a thing, you know, in the understanding of the but that's not the case in any form that cultural activity actually has. I think there's potential to democratize it, but we always have to have a step in front of the corporations, because they'll follow it up and commoditize it and appropriate pretty quickly. You know, and also, you know, I've been at this long enough to know that, you know, like when I've had the opportunity to work with big institutions, I've done work for major museums. There are forward-thinking museums who like this kind of work because they understand that their role is changing as well. So as artists, we kind of understood that the role of the artist has changed now, and we have to become electorate. And so avant-garde practitioners will kind of understand that, hopefully. But it's also the case that the institutions are starting to budge on this as well, and they kind of understand. So the museum, you know, they play this role in bringing important cultural activities to public view, right? Whether it's within the walls of the museum, but increasingly museums are supporting projects out in the world in public space. But there's also this other role that they play, which has to do with conservation and preservation, deciding what's important to save. And that's becoming more important to me as I age. I hate to admit it, but it's kind of what's the legacy if everything I do just kind of goes out of date, if I'm not there to kind of tend to it and make sure that it's keeps running somehow, which is impossible, of course. But you know that museums are expert at conservation. They just have been conserving different kinds of things. You know, the paintings, for instance, or frescoes, whatever it is. You know, they're expert at this. But it's this idea of the practice of conserving art. You know, particularly with emerging technology, can create a roadmap to the conservation of the whole of our public, you know, collective knowledge, right? Because everything we possess, you know, think of these days as digitized, but nobody's thinking about how to conserve it really. It just goes out of date instantly, right? So I think that art practices, in the context that more than I could do as an individual, but I think that there's opportunity for the institutions as well to kind of step up to the plate and say, how do we conserve digital data? You know, it's important with these acknowledged cultural artifacts, and that creates a roadmap for, you know, the daily news or whatever, you know, as it kind of, you know, it becomes lost to the vagaries of time.
Yeah. Do you have any questions? There is one question here from Richard Ferranti. Have you tried any of the iPhone LiDARs?
I know that it exists. I've been resisting buying new phones just because, you know, my question would be, how do you like it? I find that I like having the control of just being able to go back to the studio with all the stuff I need. You know, like if I travel to Taipei or something, I'm able to return home and then work on it over the course of a couple of years if I need to. It's always a matter. It's also a matter of data. Like the idea is that it's easy to generate big, impressive kind of photogrammetry assets, but the question becomes what to do with them because they're so big that most people get overwhelmed and they try and make it too perfect. And I tried to develop an aesthetic that kind of embraces the aesthetic of the flaws of the digital. So it's kind of got a little bit of a kind of roughness to it, a kind of German expressionist kind of, you know, where it's exposing its flaws, and it's good for augmented reality because it's kind of full of holes. And if you don't leave the holes, then people aren't doing the kind of cognitive thing, or they're bouncing back and forth between the real world and the virtual experience. And so the question becomes more of I suspect it's something I will look into and, you know, and see if it's a viable way of generating the material. But I created this rig, and I'm really kind of anxious to get out now that the pandemic restrictions are starting to loosen up. I plan to return to the border because I did want to say my interest in migration has now kind of evolved, and I'm interested in all kinds of migration, but particularly climate change migration. And so I'm interested in the stories of how people are having to leave their locations, whether it's in Honduras or Haiti, and how much of that's being driven by climate change. And so I'm interested in how that's manifested here locally in Boston, working with migration organizations, and then at the border where we see the kind of bottleneck, and then going ultimately to to the towns and rural places where people are having to move when the coffee crop has failed, or the water's run out and that sort of thing. And this might be a question for the open lab, the open doc lab. It might be a question after the presentation over coffee or something, but there might be room to think about that. How do we train a group of students, for instance, to take them down to the border and help facilitate the telling of these stories, so.
Great work. We're about 4 minutes left. I don't know what you had mentioned. Was there something else you wanted to show?
Well, I had a question for William, if I could, just because we said before we went live, William, you had talked about non-trauma based documentary through the Joy Lab. Was that the
Museum of Black Joy?
Yeah. And I started right off the bat with the Kamloops Indian Residential School, which is everything trauma about it. So I don't know what the place for kind of trauma-based stories are in a context like that, and who's right it is to tell those kinds of stories. But I hope that maybe you'd respond in terms of that strange juxtaposition I was feeling just as we were going live after you had mentioned the idea of embracing this idea of non-trauma-based.
Yeah, in this case, it's one of our fellows, Andrea Walls, who's Philadelphia-based, who, for a portion of her life, as a Black woman, was exposed to some major traumatic events in Philadelphia, especially around MOVE, and who documented that, who did work around that, but who's been trying to construct the other side of the story, the other side of life, which is about joy and in the rich and myriad and multi-layered ways that pervades the community, and that in a world where narratives are lobbed from one side to the other and usually have an agenda behind them. It's a really crucial intervention. So this is a project she's been working on for a while, and she's in our lab now, and working with our fellows to try to see how to push it in new directions. But I think it's just a wonderful reminder that, especially in the world of documentary, where so much is about trauma, so much is about trying to move people by showing them misery in the world that needs to be fixed. What a wonderful counterpoint. And
so what advice would you have for me, though? Because in terms of looking at these issues like climate change, migration, what would you say in that regard?
I would say,
let's have a coffee. Let's have a coffee. I think, yeah. Sarah's calling for the mic. No, just to say, I think there's a lot to be thought about there. I mean, I think that's really a huge, and because we know, there's a familiarity that kicks in when these narratives begin. And I think Rasheen's work would be a great example. You take the horrible problem of incarceration, and especially of Black males in this country, and that's a narrative we don't want to know, or we've kicked it up into numbers, or our eyes glaze over when that story starts. Rasheen, by working with Father's Lullabies, has just cut through that like a red hot knife through butter. And I mean, that's such a brilliant project. So it's that kind of genius. It takes a kind of genius, and there's a wonderful manifestation of it. So,
agree.
but we'll talk. Yeah.
Yeah, it's I think, yeah, talking after, and maybe we can I think we should put you in touch with Andrea, because the maker of this Museum of Black Joy, because she's also interested in emerging technologies and how to use them. So I think you two could have an interesting conversation. And also just celebrating even within the climate, the stories of resilience and invention that happen at the same time. And I was just listening to a author the other day who was talking about sort of how climate change solutions has to come at the local level. That's going to be neighbor to neighbor, inspiring each other and doing what they can do. So there's that whole story there of what local people are doing. So anyway, yeah, and she said she'd love to have coffee with you all about this. So we'll make that happen. Anyway, we're out of time. Thank you so much. You're always, many steps ahead of the curve in what you do. It's very inspiring. And thank you to everyone for being here today. And please join us next week when Sam Gregory will be here talking to us about his new report together with Kat Cizek and Co-Creation Studio. All right, thank you.